On today's program, we're going to touch on a number of topics related to the Middle East, including President Obama's legacy, the presidential candidates' positions on the Middle East, and the results of two recent polls on both American and Israeli attitudes. My guest today to talk about all these is Shibley Telhami, the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at University of Maryland in College Park, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Center for Middle East Policy, author of the book, The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion and the Reshaping of the Middle East. Thanks for joining me today, Shibley.
Pleasure.
I'm going to start, if we could, with a topic that I've talked about before, but that's the president's legacy, and in particular, the interview that he gave with Jeffrey Goldberg that was published in The Atlantic. It felt to me like he was blaming the Arabs for his failure. And it felt to me as if he'd given up. And that this was a way of justifying his having given up. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
Well, I think the part of blaming, I think, is a fair assessment. And it was surprising, and it's not the first time he said it. He said it a couple of times before. You know, sort of, it's the Middle East sort of stuff, or they've been at it for forever, or things like that, which was quite the stuff that he wanted to take on when he first became president. So there's no question that something has happened, and maybe it is a question of defending his legacy, that he's passing on a little bit of the blame. But you know, on the core of it, while some of what he said was contradictory, and he was thinking out loud in ways that presidents normally don't. They wait until after the presidency for one thing. We've seen, you know, how
Why would you think he would have done that? Was he being careless, or was there an intention here?
Well, it's a good question. I mulled this over in my head quite a bit, and I would have to say that he was probably careless, that he was just intellectually thinking aloud rather than sending a message of any sort at the moment to allies. I just can't see why he would want to do that, given that he would want to work with them very closely on some issues that are still hot. And, you know, obviously his visit last time. But I just want to say that on one issue, I happen to agree with him. And I happen to say that he was more right than wrong, and his critics have been more wrong. And that is on resisting to be drawn into the conflicts in the Middle East. I happen to think that a lot of his critics are wrong on that. There's a lot to criticize about the president, where he started, where he's now, his consistency, his firmness, his understanding of priorities. A lot to criticize. And as you know, I advised the administration early on. So I have a sense of where he was and where he is now. But on this one issue, which is really paramount, I happen to agree with him. I don't think the answer to the trouble in Syria would have been a more aggressive American intervention. I don't think the U.S. needed to keep a larger force in Iraq. While a lot of people suggest that would have solved the problem. And when you look at all the cases where the United States has spent so much energy and time and effort, the outcome has been exactly the opposite of what we had intended. So I think on that, I don't blame him for resisting. But the way he framed a lot of the issues, I think, unfortunately, sounded like very much different from where he started, certainly with his speech in Cairo.
Sure. I looked at it as the trajectory starting up here aspirationally with lofty goals, and then coming down to this point. It really was a downward trajectory. And on the issue of the military, it's something that I have actually spoken with him about. And if you do, Middle East leaders may want U.S. engagement, but public opinion in the Middle East does not.
Does not. And
they don't trust American engagement after Iraq in particular.
And by the way, not all Middle Eastern leaders. I mean, let's also be very clear. There's a lot of diversity. I mean, frankly, the Egyptians have constantly resisted supporting American aggressive involvement, including, you know, with their allies. I mean, they're still dependent on the Saudis and the Emiratis and everybody else for support, for aid. And they are coordinating, and they obviously have some issues on which they agree strategically, but they have absolutely opposed the idea that the U.S. should intervene in Syria. I think the Jordanians have been of mixed views privately on this. They're also caught in alliance issues. So I think it was mostly really our Gulf allies for a variety of strategic reasons. It had to do with their interpretation of the Iran threat, had to do with their own interpretation of the Arab uprisings. But I don't think it's universal even among Arab rulers. And those are the ones, of course, he's hearing from most, because that's where we're coordinating, particularly on Syria policy. You know, who was driving the support for the opposition? Who are the people with whom we interact more frequently?
I want to switch down to the current candidates, the current field of candidates and their foreign policy. Let's start with Hillary Clinton. There was also an article in the New York Times Magazine on Hillary, how Hillary became a hawk is what the article is called. And the quote that sort of struck me by the author was, unexpectedly in the bombastic, testosterone-fueled presidential election of 2016, Hillary Clinton is the last true hawk left in the race. He goes on to talk about her advocacy for keeping more troops in Iraq, about supporting the surge in Afghanistan, about the military engagement in Libya, and then even more than that on the issue of currently sending troops to Syria. She is a hawk and is almost like, in some ways, more hawkish than any of the Republicans left in the field. Does that concern you? Is that something I think that people in the region ought to be wary of?
First of all, I don't agree she's a hawk. I mean, you know, I'm not endorsing anybody in the campaign, so I'm not working for her or for Hillary Sanders, for Bernie Sanders. But you know, there are, thinking about the State Department, put her aside for a minute. The debate among experts themselves, people who are not hawks, who want diplomacy to succeed, who have been critics of the White House, who see the president as being a bit naive about the exercise of power. And so you have people who are experts in the State Department who are advising her, including people we know are not hawks, who supported the Iran nuclear deal, who didn't want to send troops to Syria, who think that you need to show that you're prepared to do something with your military power, at least a little bit, and sometimes you have to exercise that. And that's the way to use it as leverage for influencing diplomacy. With the Russians, for example, the idea is that you know, you need to create some kind of leverage to show them you mean business, otherwise they're not going to listen to you, they're going to walk all over you. Now, I'm not saying that's a good idea. You know, I happen to, as I said earlier, agree with the president that we shouldn't have sent forces, but it's a legitimate debate, and she falls more on that side. Now, whether she's doing that as part of posturing or that's really her, it's often hard to know, because she clearly thinks that that's where the general American people are. I felt from the beginning that Hillary Clinton was looking past her Democratic base way too early by positioning herself for the general election where she thinks the public is. And maybe that's not where the public is, because Trump is showing the public doesn't want intervention either. They're supporting him, and he's a non-interventionist, but that's the interpretation.
But aside from the politics of it, there is the policy involved. She did advocate for Libya, which has turned out to be a disaster. The issue of Syria, if we did the humanitarian corridor and the no-fly zone, we'd have 75,000 U.S. troops on the ground. How do you square that with saying she's not a hawk?
Well, because I know there are a lot of people who aren't hawks who are making the same argument based on how do you balance humanitarian need and creating leverage while resisting being drawn in a big way with a footprint. I don't agree with that, and so let's be clear on that. Yeah. I'm not saying I support that. I don't support that, but you know, I think if you're looking at her, particularly through her tenure as Secretary of State, you have to look at what she advocated, and you have to assess those, whether they're wise or not. And obviously, Sanders has been doing that quite wisely, because the Democratic base, I think, is very, very much averse to having the U.S. Being dragged into intervention. They see a slippery slope even in ideas like a no-fly zone in Syria. And I think in retrospect, they see the intervention in Libya to have been a failure. But remember, there was a lot of support for the intervention in Libya when it happened.
Let's go to Bernie Sanders and take a look at him for a minute, because I've been struck by the fact that in all the years I've been doing this work, I've been involved in Democratic Party work for more than 40 years. I don't ever remember a candidate, Republican or Democrat, saying the things he said. This is one. We cannot ignore the reality, he said, that you have large numbers of Palestinians who are suffering now. Poverty rates off the charts, unemployment off the charts, Gaza remaining a destroyed area. The United States has got to help work with the Palestinian people as well. I think that's the path toward peace. He not only spoke of the balance, but he sort of doubled down on the balance by speaking about Palestinians as real people. The first question is, does this, as some are saying, open the possibility for broader discourse, or is this a one-off thing? Is this Bernie Sanders said it, but we'll never hear it again in the rest of this campaign, and we may not hear it again from anybody else? I mean, certainly this hasn't had an impact on Congress. Does it have an impact on the policy debate or not?
First of all, it's not a one-off thing. I can tell you, and in a minute I'll tell you why. It's not a one-off thing. It's a revolutionary thing for sure. It's extraordinary for some presidential candidate with a real prospect to say that. And not only did he say it and defend it, but he even put the other candidate on the defensive for not agreeing with him. And this is really quite amazing in the history of American presidential debates. So yes, it's historic. Now, what drove it? In December 2014, almost a year and a half ago, I wrote a piece on the Washington Post Monkey Cage that was based on a poll that I did in the United States the month before, which showed that Democrats were far more to the left of their politicians on the Israel-Palestine question, where one half of Democrats, a full half of all Democrats, wanted to impose punitive measures against Israel on the settlement issue, where a majority wanted to support or at least abstain from a UN resolution on Palestine at the UN. You know what? Can I stop you right there?
We were going to go to some of those poll numbers in a bit, and I don't want to move out of sequence a minute, but
sure.
But clearly the Democratic base is there, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But do you think that Bernie Sanders is going to have acolytes? Is there going to be will this resonate with other politicians who will put their finger up in the air and say, you know, Bernie got away with it and it worked with the base, I'm going to try it too?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
in the primaries, not necessarily in the general election. Oh, in the Democratic primaries, because that's where the Democrats are. America is divided. Republicans and Democrats are not on the same place on this issue. But among Democrats, yes. And let me give you an example to make the point. I was at a high-profile conference in December on the Israeli-American relationship. These are people you know, including a congressional Democratic leader. I wouldn't mention his name because it was not on the without attribution. And he's somebody who is very supportive of Israel. Is considered to be one of the biggest supporters of Israel in the Congress. And he said to his Israeli colleagues in that meeting that the gap between elected officials and grassroots on issues is widening, and it's making it difficult for people like him to continue as is. That tells you that this is something, it's not about personality, it's about real base, change of the base in a manner that made Bernie Sanders predictable. I predicted that this issue was going to become an issue in the primaries back in December 2014.
Let's go to Donald Trump, the presumptive nominee, and somebody who has had not much to say about the Middle East, except for the APEC speech, which was pretty horrific, but did raise the issue of balance at one point, although he's never come back to it again, but is non-interventionist. That is clearly one aspect. Is there anything coherent at all about his foreign policy? He gave a foreign policy address, but I'm having trouble sewing the pieces together. Do you see anything there?
Well, I read his speech today, and I heard part of it actually live. And of course, it's incoherent and contradictory. And so if you want to put it out there, I don't think you can make much sense of it. He said all that he needed to say as a front runner to make it safe and move forward. But what I'm hearing, if you listen very carefully to him, the economic issue is very clear what he's addressing. But on foreign policy issues, first and foremost, a non-interventionist. That's obvious. I mean, he outdoes. He thinks Libya was. He thinks the overthrow of Mubarak was a mistake. He thinks Libyan intervention was a mistake. He thinks Iraq was a mistake. He doesn't think we needed to intervene more in Syria. So he has taken a non-interventionist position. Where he has framed his policy is in relation to what he calls radical Islam or radical Islamist groups. And on that issue, interestingly, listening to him today, on that issue, many Arab governments actually agree with him. He might frighten some people, but he actually, when he says we don't want to do regime change, we shouldn't be in the business of regime change. We need to confront radical Islamic groups, exactly what Sisi in Egypt says. They want to go frontally. We want to cooperate with Arab allies on that issue. We want to confront Iran because Iran is the winner out of the Iraq war. That's music to a lot of rulers' ears in the Arab world. The public is going to have mixed feelings because of the way he frames the Islamic issue. The immigration issue still brings that up in his speech today on foreign policy. But by and large, I don't think he's being seen as threatening by Arab rulers as we think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's look at some of the polling. You've done some fascinating polling, and I want to start, if we could, I think we're going to start with the U.S. polling. Here is the partisan divide issue you mentioned. The red is Republican, the purple is independent, and the blue is Democrat. Whether they want the U.S. to lean toward Israel, lean toward the Palestinians, or lean toward neither side. Republicans, heavily influenced by the religious right, and neocons are almost split on the lean toward Israel or neither side. But the Democratic numbers and the independents are off the charts. Explain where that comes from and where do you think it's going?
Well, first of all, overall, historically, I mean, really for the past 25 years, I've been asking a similar question for the past 25 years. You always have roughly 2/3 of Americans say, we want the U.S. to lean toward neither side. That hasn't changed much. It's just that the people who want the U.S. to lean toward Israel over the Palestinians are larger, but it's always a minority. It's not a majority of the public. What has happened, it used to be that the same story was in the Republican Party as the Democratic Party. Over time, what we see is more and more Democrats want the U.S. to be more even-handed, and more Republicans want the U.S. to take Israel's side. And when you look at the demographics of that, you find that much of that 45% red that you see there that says, I want the U.S. to lean toward Israel, is coming from the evangelical right. 75% of evangelicals are Republicans, and when you ask them whether they want the U.S. to lean toward Israel or be even-handed, the overwhelming majority want the U.S. to lean toward Israel. If you take them out of the Republican Party, if you look at non-evangelical Republicans, the Republican Party starts looking like the rest of America on this issue. And on the Democratic side, it's pretty consistent, more so among the growing majorities of the Democratic Party. Hispanic Americans want the U.S. to be more even-handed. African Americans, women, young people, especially young people, the millennials, those are the people who are supporting.
Yeah, I did a piece a while back on polling similar to this and said we've looked at it as a partisan divide. It's actually a demographic divide.
Exactly.
And the parties are now almost two distinct demographic groups. White, middle-class, middle-aged evangelicals here, and minorities and young people and educated women down there. Not necessarily a good thing for the ability to build bipartisan consensus on issues, but clearly an interesting phenomenon.
It is. It's partly demographic, undoubtedly, and you see that. But partly even philosophical. For example, what I've been writing on, another Zogby, John Zogby, wrote this book called The New Globals.
Yeah.
And the New Globals, which is, by the way, an excellent little book, and I think he's onto something because I've been discovering that everywhere. Yeah. I have a paper on the new cosmopolitans versus the particularists, the people who want to focus on a particular identity, whether religious identity, national identity. And it's again clustered along those two parties. It goes beyond the millennials. You're talking about people who want to be plugged into the world, who see themselves as part of the world, and people who just want to focus on
Let's take a look at the next one, which is another policy issue for the U.S., and that is if there's a vote in the Security Council, which there may well be this year yet, what should the U.S. do? Vote in favor of endorsing a Palestinian state. Democrats 39%, Republicans 18-15 for independence. Vote against endorsing a Palestinian state. Republicans overwhelmingly in that corner. And then abstain from voting. Independents 65%, 42% for Democrats. So that basically, if a resolution were to come to the UN, you'd have over 80% of Democrats saying vote for it or abstain. And independents, almost 80% as well. Only Republicans would be opposed to
actually,
such a
even the
resolution.
Republicans, when you look at it, only 43%, still a minority,
Yeah.
who want to oppose. So if you add the abstain and the support, they still get a slight majority. There's obviously an intensity. Republicans are more divided, obviously, but they're not opposing it. But you could see why, for the Democrats, if you're Bernie Sanders, the public is, the Democratic public is on your side of the issue when in framing this question. And this deep divide really tells you the story. When you're watching a Democratic presidential debate and you're watching a Republican presidential debate, and you're seeing the Republicans, one after the other, saying, my friend Bibi Netanyahu, my friend Bibi Netanyahu. And that name only comes up once in the debate among Democrats, and only because Bernie Sanders is saying we shouldn't always agree with him. Well, in my poll, when you ask people whom do you admire most in the world, Republicans name Bibi Netanyahu out of the blue to equivalent to Ronald Reagan. And of course, he doesn't show up on the Democratic side. So
actually, Democrats 3-1 have a negative attitude toward Netanyahu,
That's right.
which is really quite historic. Let's go now to polling you've done in Israel. You worked with Pew on some rather wide-ranging polling of Israeli Jews, but also Israeli Arabs on a number of questions. Oh, this is an American question, American attitude toward Muslims. I want to just look at that because it also brings out this divide. The red is Republican, the dark blue is Democrat, and the gray is independent. Attitude toward Muslims. And you see Republicans actually quite negative. Democrats split, but leaning more favorably, indicating again the same generational and racial divide that is the partisan divide. But now let's go to the polling in Israel, because I think it's fascinating, and it raises some very interesting policy questions. This is the question asked of Israel, and this became a big story in Israel and here in the United States. Israeli Jews were asked the question, should Arabs be expelled or transferred from Israel? And the numbers were really quite shocking, because overall it was almost split. And here's just the age breakout: 18 to 49 is blue, and 50 plus is in red. But if you look overall, there was almost an even divide between they should be expelled or transferred, or that they should not. That was worrisome.
Yeah, let me clarify. I was one of many advisors to the Pew poll. It's not my poll; it's the Pew poll.
Right.
But nonetheless, it was an important poll. It's an extensive poll, a very large number of people over a long period of time, and this is really extraordinary. It's shocking. And unexpected, and that's why it generated so much debate. Now, we knew obviously that there was, historically, when you have conflict, rising and there's violence, hearts harden. We know the Palestinians have become more supportive of violence, after the death of the peace process and the frustrations with the settlements and everything else. And we know the Israelis have also hardened, but we didn't know the extent of it. This is really extraordinary, because at least even if you read the wording, Arabs should be expelled. What is Arabs? Whether they're referring to citizens. This was done among citizens. There's a whole debate within the Israelis. Did that mean citizens? Well, I think it did. But even if it meant just Arabs inside or the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, is still an extraordinary thing to have happened. And so, more than that, this is just, of course, the extreme version of it. But when you look at one other troubling question is whether Israeli Jews think that Jews should have preferential treatment within Israel itself. We're not talking about the West Bank. Within Israel.
Let's put that up because we got that board here too. No. Yes.
So
should Israeli Jews agree or strongly agree that it's the birthright of Jews to make aliyah to Israel, to go to Israel? 98% yes. Jews deserve preferential treatment in Israel, 79%, but the percentage of Israelis who are Arab is 20%. So basically their rights are being dismissed as equal by 79% of the population. And why this one is important is because there are refugees and Palestinians who can't go back. But the argument is being made that this is our place and not yours. And so an interesting
this
yet
one is less
troubling
surprising
dilemma.
in the sense that that's, of course, the raison d'etre of the state of Israel. It's less surprising. But this one is incredibly surprising, the 79%, where you're not saying, you're going beyond this. The contrast here is that because there were separate issues, there was little doubt that this second one, the preferential treatment, wasn't related to the birthright issue, that this is citizenship preferential treatment. And so even assuming this, you still want this, which is something a little bit more. And yes, it's a troubling. There's people who worry about the democracy issue and the Jewishness versus democracy issue. It's very troubling. And if you're one of the 20% Arab citizens of Israel who are fighting for full equality, I think it's it's an issue that they fight every day.
There was plenty of commentary in Israel provoked by this, asking some very thoughtful questions about where the country's heading and whether or not democracy is even possible at this point. I mean, going beyond the issue of two states, asking about, does this work right now? What is the future for the Arab citizens of the state, given this mindset?
Well, there are two things I would say. One is that, it's very hard to separate what's happening on the West Bank of the rest of the Palestinians and Gaza and Arabs inside. I mean, they're part of the same people ethnically. They often have relatives across. And so what happens when there's trouble in the West Bank and Gaza, when that issue is unresolved, it raises tension inside, because what you're going to have is Palestinians are going to sympathize with the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza. There's Palestinian citizens of Israel. And the Jewish citizens are going to resent them or think that they're disloyal for expressing that sympathy. And it's impossible, first of all, to separate the two. Second, I think one of the things that we have had here in the discourse in this country is problematic related to this. We have allowed ourselves to talk about, quote, the Arabs as a demographic problem for Israel, meaning, we should worry about Arab populations growing because it undermines, quote, the Jewishness of Israel. I think we should tie our policy on the West Bank and Gaza simply to international law and obligations, not to this discourse about demographics. And finally, I think the administration has not made enough of a case that if you're supporting Israel as a Jewish state or as a state that manifests Jewish self-determination, you also have to add, and a state of all its citizens equally. And that is as important as the other part.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're out of time, but it was a fascinating discussion. For more information, follow us on Twitter at AAIUSA, or check us out on our website, aaiusa.org. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week on Viewpoint.